A single punch destroyed this man's life. These are 3 disturbing CCTV incidents that remain unsolved to this day. Fleeing the unknown. What makes a man run for his life in broad daylight through an airport, across a field, and into the woods, never to be seen again? Lars Mittank, a 28-year-old German, walked in to Varna Airport on July 8, 2014 for his flight. Within minutes, he vanished into thin air. Last CCTV footage shows him barefoot in a yellow t-shirt running frantically across the tarmac and looking over his shoulder. But who or what was he running from? To understand Lars' disappearance, we will have to start with some context. Lars was an ordinary warehouse worker from Itzehoe, Germany. He had no criminal record, no history of mental illness, and no obsession with danger or travel. In fact, this was his first trip abroad without his parents. 9 days ago, Lars landed in Varna, Bulgaria with 5 of his friends for a week-long trip. They spent their days drinking cheap beer at the Golden Sands bar, swimming, and watching football. But on July 6, just one night before their flight home, everything changed. At a bar near the Golden Sands Strip, Lars got into a heated argument with a group of German tourists over football. The group was a supporter of Bayern Munich, the rival of Lars' favored Werder Bremen. The argument quickly became violent, and Lars, being alone, didn't stand a chance against the 4 of them. One of the men who he argued with punched Lars, leaving him visibly shaken with a bruised jaw and a ruptured eardrum. When he returned to the hotel, he told his friends more than what had just happened. In a paranoid voice, Lars stated that it wasn't over, and those Germans would hire others to come after him. The next morning, after examining his injuries, a local doctor suggested that Lars shouldn't fly home yet. He also prescribed Cefprozil, a common antibiotic. But here's where it got complicated. That drug, though safe for most, can rarely cause psychotic side effects like paranoia and hallucinations. His friends offered to stay back with him, but Lars insisted he'd be fine, so they left. Now he was left alone in a different country he knew no one in, with a brain that kept running wild. He booked the hotel color for his one-night stay, but the staff soon found him pacing the halls, looking out the windows and whispering to himself. The CCTV footage shows him walking in and out of the elevator repeatedly, as if hiding from someone. At one point, he even called his mother Sandra at 3 a.m., frantically whispering into the phone,
"There's a group of men trying to attack me. They're gonna kill me."
He begged her to cancel all his credit cards and immediately book him a new flight. She tried to calm Lars down, but nothing seemed to work. And that night, he suddenly left the hotel only to come back even more agitated than before. He called his mother again the next morning, saying he didn't feel safe and that they were getting closer. With just how panicked he was, it couldn't be just paranoia from medication. So, was Lars actually being followed? After a night of distress, it was finally July 8th, the day of his flight. Lars made his way to Varna Airport and texted his mom about arriving at the terminal and waiting for medical clearance to fly. When Dr. Kosta Kostov at the airport's medical office examined him, everything seemed fine. However, Lars was trembling and his eyes were constantly darting to the door. When a construction worker entered the room in a blue shirt, Lars finally snapped. His pupils widened and he screamed, "I don't want to die here! I have to get out of here!" He ran out of the medical room and burst through the terminal door, leaving his passport, phone, suitcase, and wallet behind. He kept running across the parking lot, down the road, and toward a 6-foot chain-link fence. Climbing it in seconds, he landed in a field of sunflowers and disappeared into the forest beyond. And that was the last time anyone ever saw Lars Mittank. Bulgarian police launched an immediate search with helicopters, canine dogs, and combed through the forest, but there was no trace of Lars. Now, over the years, there were sightings of a man matching Lars' description, hitchhiking in Varna, another in Greece, and another in Germany, but none proved to be him. It was as if he'd vanished from reality itself, and that was most definitely not a side effect of cefprozil. The airport footage was leaked online, and millions of internet sleuths analyzed it frame by frame, coming up with different theories. By 2018, Lars was even given the title of the most famous missing person on YouTube. According to the famous drug theory, the antibiotic combined with head trauma must have caused Lars to experience a drug-induced breakdown. Now, this would explain him frantically running into the woods and probably fainting from dehydration. However, Dr. Costa put a stop to those speculations. It turns out Lars never took those meds in the first place. So he couldn't have side effects from meds he never took. Lars was punched in the head extremely hard, so him having a sudden psychotic break from trauma and stress seems like a more plausible theory. Amidst all speculation, the image of a man in a blue shirt who was seen for merely seconds in the doctor's office doorway before Lars fled sits at the top. Who was he? Why did Lars panic the moment he saw him? And although some sleuths claim he was just a construction worker, most theorists believe that man could be the one Lars was running from. To this day, Lars remains unfound. But the next character didn't only try to vanish himself, he made others disappear in the name of love. Final act of revenge. Seeing the materials this man is buying, you might think he's going camping, but what he actually did with them shocked the entire community. This is Kyle Clifford, a 26-year-old security guard from Hertfordshire who had been dating John's youngest daughter, Louise Hunt, for almost 18 months. By most accounts, things seemed fine between them. But in June 2024, things took a dramatic turn. Louise decided to end the relationship so she could have some space and start anew. However, Kyle wasn't ready to let go. Instead of moving on, his heartbreak turned into rage. In his mind, if he can't have her, no one else can. He became increasingly obsessed and began stalking Louise, messaging all her friends and watching her home. And when nothing worked, Kyle's fixation led to a terrifying plan. Over the months, he began purchasing weapons, a crossbow, a knife, a rope, and petrol. At the same time, he went to Louise's home in Bushy, not to meet her, but to watch her house like a hunter studying his prey, understanding her schedule and how she moves throughout the day. Even the security footage caught Kyle's creeping outside, but nobody put much thought into it, believing he'd eventually move on. What they didn't know was that he wasn't planning to reconcile. He was planning something much worse. On July 9th, 2024, Kyle came to Louise's house again with her belongings and a thank you note. He knew at the time that only her mother, 61-year-old Carol Hunt, and Louise would be inside with her sister, Hannah Hunt, returning from work shortly after. Carol was the first one to greet him at the door. Seeing the stuff in his hand, she believed he had come to say the long overdue goodbye before moving on with his life. I mean, he did intend to do that, but not in a way she would have expected. The moment Louise's mother, Carol, let him into the living room, Kyle pulled out a knife and stabbed her in the chest and abdomen several times, ending her life instantly. And unfortunately, he was only getting started, patiently waiting for Louise to appear. When she did, he immediately overpowered and tied her up. But he didn't plan to end her life instantly like her mother's. First, he forced himself on her, inflicting her with unimaginable suffering, and finally shot her with a crossbow bolt. Reports suggest that he had kept Louise tied up and alive for 2 hours to bear everything. It's hard to fathom this was the same guy who claimed to be madly in love with her. Louise was gone, so was her mother, but it still wasn't enough for him. Kyle now waited for Louise's sister Hannah to return from work. The moment she set foot inside, something felt wrong. The house was unusually quiet. And before she could react, Kyle appeared in the hallway with the crossbow in hand. He shot Hannah straight through the chest, causing her to collapse and bolted out the door. Minutes later, Kyle ditched his car near the neighborhood woods and disappeared without a trace. Back at the Hunts' home, somehow, Hannah was still breathing. With the last ounce of her strength, she reached for her phone and dialed 999. But before help could arrive, she too had succumbed to her injuries. Later that evening, John Hunt finally arrived home after a day's work to a nightmare no one could have prepared him for. His wife and both children brutally murdered. Upon investigation, officers highlighted how there were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, and no struggle at the door. Whoever did this must be someone the family trusted enough to let inside. Soon, the timeline came together for the CCTV footage of a familiar face buying the crossbow from a store and footage of the same man outside the Hunts' home. Finally, the weapon receipts confirmed what John expected. It was Kyle Clifford, and this was his revenge. But if revenge was the goal, Kyle should have only gone after Louise. Why target Caroline and Hannah? Psychological profiling suggests that in cases like this, offenders not only target the victims, but also those close to them. For them, it's a way to extend punishment, to make the victim suffer emotionally, even in death. And if we look at the timeline of the deaths, Kyle eliminated Louise after her mother, Caroline. He raped her and kept her alive and made sure she would die with the guilt of her mother's death as well. The manhunt intensified with helicopters scanning the countryside and armed officers surrounding potential hideouts. Finally, after 22 hours, he was discovered miles away, hiding in a cemetery in Enfield, North London. But Kyle didn't want to be caught. He turned the crossbow and shot himself in the chest. Police quickly apprehended him, taking him straight to the hospital in extremely critical condition, barely showing signs of life. And after hours of surgery, the doctors managed to save him. However, that was just the beginning of karma's payback. Upon regaining consciousness, doctors told him the punishment before the judge. The bolt damaged his spine, and he'll have to spend the rest of his life bound to a wheelchair. Now karma had its way with him, but justice was still waiting for its turn. Months later, he faced trial at Cambridge Crown Court, where the investigators revealed the twisted last letters he had written, justifying how, since he couldn't live without Louise, he killed her. The jury declared Kyle guilty on all counts: triple murder, rape, false imprisonment, and weapon offenses. Kyle didn't even attend his own sentencing, but Judge Joel Benathan made sure he received a befitting sentence.
The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. I therefore make clear at once that for each of these three, the sentence will be one of life imprisonment with a whole life order. That means a sentence from which you will never be released.
If you think he deserved what he got, I allow you to press that subscribe button below. And let's move on to the most disturbing case left. Faceless Culprit. One evening, 50-year-old Lincolnshire resident Alan Wood came home from work, closed his door, and disappeared from the world. No one heard any struggle nor any break-in, yet 3 days later, what police found inside his home would haunt them for the next 16 years. Alan was a kind of man one could never dislike. He was a part-time worker at Sainsbury in the nearby town of Bourne, earning extra cash as a gardener in a local prison. After separating from his wife Joanne years ago, Alan lived alone in a detached bungalow called Manor House in the tiny village of Lound. He never owed anyone money and had a fairly good relationship with his family. It was clear that the man had no enemies. But on October 21st, 2009, something happened that painted an entirely different picture of the otherwise non-problematic Alan. That day, Alan clocked out of work and stopped by a small pub in Little Bytham, the Willowbury Arms, for his usual drink with friends. When he reached home, someone was waiting for him. The identity of the person is still a mystery. Whether they entered the apartment together or someone was waiting for Alan inside, no one knows. But that was the last day Alan was seen alive. Over the next 3 days, when he didn't show up at work, his colleagues began to worry. It wasn't usual for Alan to skip shifts, and after multiple calls went unanswered, a friend decided to check up on him. When no one answered the door, she decided to enter, immediately seeing Alan's lifeless body lying in the living room, tied up with sellotape. He had been stabbed multiple times in the head, and his throat had been sliced open. There was clear evidence of torture. The autopsy reports revealed the true intensity of this brutal murder. Turns out the deep cuts across the back of his neck weren't random. It was an attempted decapitation. Police called it the work of a psychotic mind, given how deliberate the injuries were. Many even suspected that Alan was tortured for a whole day and actually died the next day on the 23rd. The lack of any signs of forced entry or struggle at the doorway suggests it could be someone Alan knew. But who could inflict such brutality on a peaceful man, and why? As detectives searched through the house, they noticed a key detail. Alan's bank cards were missing, and sure enough, new activity had appeared on his accounts within hours. The offenders were using Alan's cards at cash machines throughout Bourne, Stamford, and Sainsbury itself. CCTV footage of those areas showed a young white man aged 25 to 35 with short dark hair standing at the ATM. He was wearing a striped scarf and was walking with a slight limp after he made the withdrawals. There were no signs of remorse in his demeanor, and he stole about 300 to 400 pounds over 2 days. Even though the man's face was partially hidden, his body language indicated that he knew someone was watching him. He just didn't care. When the footage went viral, that man became renowned as the ATM Man. Amidst the investigation, forensic evidence busted the myth that Alan was inflicted with suffering for a whole day. The results suggested he had died the same day. But that wasn't all. The investigators also extracted a full male DNA profile from the sellotape and around the scene. There were bloody footprints of size 8 Converse trainers and tire tracks outside the property. The strangest of all was a fragment of a blue bus ticket stuck to the sellotape binding Alan's hands. The ticket was traced to a tiny regional company delaying buses which operated in nearby areas. This indicated that the assailant was traveling locally by bus before the attack. With that kind of evidence, both physical and forensic, it should have been an easy case. But the DNA didn't match anyone in the entire UK. In fact, it didn't match in international checks as well. It's disturbing how someone can leave behind that much of themselves and still can't be found. Lincolnshire police launched a full-scale operation which became one of the largest in the country's history. Over 20,000 people were interviewed and hundreds of potential suspects were swabbed for DNA. And when that didn't work, they took a different approach towards the case. Instead of asking who did it, they focused on the why behind it. Why was Alan, of all people, targeted? It couldn't have been a robbery, since Alan only had about 700 pounds in cash. You don't torture and nearly decapitate someone for 700 pounds, I hope. There must be something that no one has been able to deduce. Locals came up with a theory of their own: mistaken identity. They believe the killer's true target was another Sainsbury manager who looked like Alan, and that Alan was murdered by mistake. As the years passed, every promising lead in Alan's case went cold. He no longer appeared in headlines, but his family continued to search for him. Alan's bungalow stayed sealed for 2 years before being demolished, and his case still remains open. Even with new forensic technology and the CCTV footage that once promised answers, all the authorities ever found were more questions. And if your thirst for the disturbing isn't fulfilled yet, well, you might want to check out this video.